Imagine having everything you ever wanted, fame, fortune, a legacy that will outlive you, and feeling completely, utterly empty. Leo Tolstoy had reached the peak of human achievement. His novels War and Peace and Anna Karenina were hailed as masterpieces. His name was immortalized in literature, and he had wealth beyond what most people could ever dream of. Yet he stood on the edge of an abyss, staring into nothingness. Every morning he woke with a crushing weight on his chest. A single, inescapable question haunted him. What is the meaning of life if everything ends in death? This question didn't just trouble him, it threatened to destroy him. It wasn't an abstract curiosity, it was an existential crisis that gripped his soul and refused to let go. No achievement, no admiration, no amount of love could silence it. The more he succeeded, the deeper the void within him grew. He had everything, but it felt like he had nothing. Tolstoy described his life as a man running through the woods, chased by a monstrous beast, death. He clung to a fragile branch over an abyss, knowing that sooner or later he would have to let go. So what was the point of it all? Success had failed him, wealth had failed him, intellectual brilliance had failed him. If everything he had worked for was destined to vanish, then what was left? This was not just Tolstoy's question. This is the question that haunts anyone who has ever chased success, only to find themselves more lost than before. He turned to philosophy, to science, to logic, desperately searching for an answer. He read Schopenhauer, Kant, and the existentialists, hoping that their wisdom would provide relief. But the more he read, the deeper his despair grew. Science was merciless. It reduced life to an accident, a random occurrence in a universe indifferent to human suffering. Philosophy dissected the nature of existence but offered no true comfort. The cold logic of reason only amplified his torment. If death was the only certainty, then was life nothing more than a cruel joke? He saw only two possible conclusions: accept that life was meaningless and surrender to despair, or end his own life to escape its absurdity. And he came terrifyingly close to choosing the latter. Tolstoy admitted in his writings that he had to hide ropes from himself, that he avoided carrying a gun, because he knew deep down that he might use it. His despair was not poetic, it was real, it was consuming. Yet despite standing on the edge of the abyss, something within him resisted. Something told him that meaning was not an illusion, that he had been looking in the wrong place. So instead of surrendering, he did something unexpected. He stopped looking at the philosophers, the intellectuals, the elite thinkers. Instead, he turned his gaze to the people who lived without wealth, without fame, without deep intellectual musings. The simple, ordinary people, the ones society overlooked. And what he found shattered his understanding of meaning itself. Tolstoy became fascinated with the working class, farmers, laborers, peasants. By all rational measures, they should have been more lost than him. They had none of his success, none of his knowledge, none of his comforts. Yet they lived with a quiet peace that he had never known. They did not ask whether life had meaning. They lived as if it did. Tolstoy observed them closely. They found purpose not in achievements, but in their families, in their traditions, in their daily routines. They worked hard, suffered deeply, yet moved forward with an acceptance that eluded him. What did they know that he didn't? They were not searching for absolute certainty the way he was. They did not demand a grand, intellectual explanation for existence. They embraced mystery. They accepted suffering. And most importantly, they did not fear death in the way he did. Their faith in something beyond themselves, whether it was God, tradition, or simply the rhythm of life, gave them a peace that no philosopher could ever put into words. And that's when it hit him. Tolstoy had spent his entire life trying to think his way into meaning, but meaning was not an intellectual equation. It was not something that could be solved like a puzzle. It was something that had to be lived. For years, he had believed that meaning had to be absolute, provable, irrefutable, that it had to stand the test of logic and reason. But now he saw that the real illusion was not meaninglessness. The real illusion was his belief that meaning had to be justified. The people he observed did not need an airtight philosophical system to validate their existence. they simply lived. Tolstoy realized that meaning was not something you find. It's something you create through love, through connection, through the simple act of being fully present in life. This revelation did not come as a thunderbolt, but as a slow unraveling of everything he once believed. He saw that peace did not come from intellectual brilliance or external success. It came from surrendering to life rather than resisting it. For the first time, he understood. Life does not need to be justified. It only needs to be lived. But his journey wasn't over, because if success had failed him, then what was truly worth pursuing? Determined to find a final answer, Tolstoy ventured even deeper into the unknown, and what he discovered next would change him forever. Tolstoy had spent years constructing his life around achievements, believing that success would bring him fulfillment. But now everything he had built felt like an illusion. So he asked himself, if wealth, fame, and knowledge have failed me, then what is truly worth living for? To answer this, he did something radical. He began to strip his life down to its core. Gone were the grand philosophical debates, the endless intellectual justifications. He turned his focus entirely to how people actually lived, not what they claimed to believe, not the theories they debated, but how they truly moved through the world. And what he saw changed him forever. He saw that the people who found peace in life had something in common. They lived not for themselves, but for something greater. This was not about religion or ideology or blind faith. It was about something deeper, a shift from ego to purpose, from self to service. For years, Tolstoy had been obsessed with the meaning of his life, his legacy, his impact, his search for truth. But what if meaning isn't something we possess? What if meaning is something that emerges only when we stop making ourselves the center of everything? Tolstoy saw this reflected in the simplest acts of daily existence. A mother caring for her child, a farmer tending his crops, not for wealth, but to feed others, a laborer building a home that he himself would never live in. They were not obsessed with meaning, and yet they had found it. They had found it in duty, in love, in the quiet, unglamorous work of simply being part of something larger than themselves. And in this realization, Tolstoy saw his own failure. He had spent his life trying to intellectualize existence, to justify it through achievements, to prove his worth through recognition. But meaning had never been hidden in philosophy books or literary masterpieces. It had always been right in front of him, in the lives of the people he had overlooked. And so he let go. He let go of his obsession with personal greatness. He let go of the belief that meaning had to be an absolute, irrefutable concept. Instead, he embraced the simple truth. Life is not something you solve, it's something you serve. And this changed everything. Tolstoy's transformation was not just a shift in thought, it was a complete unraveling of the man he used to be. He rejected his aristocratic privileges. He stopped dressing like a nobleman and began wearing the simple clothes of a peasant. He renounced much of his wealth, believing that material success had only poisoned his soul. He started working alongside farmers, living modestly, dedicating himself to a life of service rather than ambition. And for the first time, he felt free. But the world around him didn't understand. His family was horrified. His wife, who had supported him through years of literary fame, felt betrayed. She had married the great Tolstoy, the man who wrote epic novels and dined with aristocrats. And now he was talking about abandoning everything they had built together? His friends were baffled. His fellow intellectuals thought he had gone mad. But Tolstoy knew that, for the first time in his life, he was finally seeing clearly. And he was not afraid to speak the truth as he saw it. He turned against everything he once stood for. He denounced the very class he had been born into. He criticized the Russian Orthodox Church, arguing that its rituals had become empty, its teachings corrupted by power. He condemned the government, calling out the exploitation of the poor by the wealthy elite. And the establishment turned against him. The church excommunicated him. His writings were banned. The same intellectuals who once praised his genius now dismissed him as a lunatic. But none of it mattered, because Tolstoy was no longer living for their approval. He had found something greater than himself. He devoted the rest of his life to serving the poor, advocating for nonviolence, and promoting a way of life built on simplicity, humility, and love. And the more he gave himself to this path, the more he saw that he had been wrong about something else too. For years, he had feared death. It was the shadow that had haunted him, the abyss that had nearly swallowed him whole. But now, for the first time, he was no longer afraid. Because death, he realized, was only terrifying if you believe that your existence is all that matters. If you live only for yourself, then of course death feels like an unbearable tragedy, because it's the end of everything you have built. But if you live for something beyond yourself, if you serve a purpose greater than your own desires, then death is not an erasure, it's just a transition. Tolstoy saw this truth reflected in the same simple people who had first shaken his worldview. They did not fear death as he once did, because their lives were not built around self-importance. They had already given themselves to something greater, and in that they were free. So Tolstoy let go. He let go of the illusion of control. He let go of the desperate need for validation. He let go of the fear that had once consumed him. And he finally found peace, not in books, not in philosophy, not in accolades, but in the quiet, steady act of living with purpose. Tolstoy's final years were not spent in palaces or literary circles. He lived humbly in the countryside, devoting himself to his newfound truth. And then, at the age of 82, he made one last, fateful decision. One night, he quietly left his home, abandoning his estate, his family, his possessions, everything. He set out alone, seeking something, perhaps solitude, perhaps one final moment of clarity. He never made it to his destination. He fell ill on the journey and died in a small, rural train station. A man who once had everything, dying in the most ordinary place imaginable. And yet, he died free. His story is not just about one man's search for meaning. It is about a universal human truth. We spend our lives chasing shadows, success, fame, recognition, believing that they will make us whole. But meaning is not something we find. It is something we create, not through intellect, not through ambition, but through the way we choose to live, through love, through service, through the quiet, everyday moments that we so often overlook. Tolstoy's journey reminds us of a truth that is easy to forget. The purpose of life is not to prove your worth. It is to give yourself away to something greater than yourself. And when you do that, when you surrender to life instead of trying to control it, you will never have to fear death again. If this video challenged you, if it made you think differently about your own life, then don't let this be the end of the conversation. Subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and let's continue exploring these ideas together. Because in a world obsessed with chasing meaning, perhaps the greatest secret is that meaning was never lost to begin with. Until next time, keep questioning, keep growing, and most importantly, keep living.